History of the World by J. M. Roberts. Book 4, The Age of Diverging Culture. Chapter 7, Imperial China. Since it failed to survive, the Mongol regime cannot be considered wholly successful. But this does not take us far. Much that was positive was done in just over a century. Foreign trade flourished as never before. Marco Polo reports that the poor of Peking were fed by the largesse of the great Khan, and it was a big city. A modern eye finds something attractive too about the Mongols' treatment of religion. Only Muslims were hindered in preaching of their doctrine. Taoism and Buddhism were positively encouraged, for example, by relieving Buddhist monasteries of taxes. This, of course, meant heavier impositions on others, as any state support for religion must. The peasants paid for religious enlightenment. In the 14th century, natural disasters combined with the Mongol exactions to produce a fresh wave of rural rebellion, the telling symptom of a dynasty in decline. They may have been made worse by Mongol concessions to the Chinese gentry. Giving landlords new rights over their peasants can hardly have won the regime popular support. Secret societies began to appear again, and one of them, the Red Turbans, attracted support from gentry and officials. One of its leaders, Chu Yuan Chang, a monk, seized Nanking in 1356. 12 years later, he drove the Mongols from Peking and the Ming era began. Yet, like many other Chinese revolutionary leaders, Chu Yuan Chang became an upholder of the traditional order. The dynasty he founded, though it presided over a great cultural flowering and managed to maintain the political unity of China, which was to last from Mongol times to the 12th century, confirmed China's conservatism and isolation. In the early 15th century, the maritime expeditions by great fleets came to an end. An imperial decree forbade Chinese ships to sail beyond coastal waters or individuals to travel abroad. Soon, Chinese shipyards lost the capacity to build the great ocean-going junks. They did not even retain their specifications. The great voyages of the eunuch Cheng Hu, a Chinese Vasco da Gama, were almost forgotten. At the same time, the merchants who had prospered under the Mongols were harassed. In the end, the Ming dynasty ran to seed. A succession of emperors virtually confined to their palaces, while favorites and imperial princes disputed around them, the enjoyment of the imperial estates registered the decline, and eunuchs emerged as dominant figures in the government. Except in Korea, where the Japanese were beaten off at the end of the 16th century, the Ming could not maintain the peripheral zones of Chinese empire. Indochina fell away from the Chinese sphere. Tibet went more or less out of Chinese control, and in 1544, the Mongols burnt the suburbs of Peking. Under the Ming, too, came the first Europeans to seek more than a voyage of trade or discovery. In 1557, Portuguese established themselves at Macau. They had little to offer that Chinese wanted, except silver, but Jesuit missionaries followed, and the official tolerance of Confucian tradition gave them opportunities they successfully exploited. They became very influential at the Ming court after one of them, Matteo Ricci, established himself there in 1602. But while he and other Jesuits were admired for their learning by some Chinese officials, others began to feel alarmed. By then, though besides the mechanical toys and clocks which the missionaries added to the imperial collections, their scientific and cosmographical learning had begun to interest Chinese intellectuals. The correction of the Chinese calendar, which one Jesuit carried out, was of great importance, for the authenticity of emperors' sacrifices depended on accurate dating. From the Jesuits, the Chinese learned also to cast heavy cannon, another useful art. Early in the 17th century, the Ming needed any military advantages they could procure. They were threatened from the north by a people living in Manchuria, a province to which they later gave its name, but who were not known as Manchu until their conquest of China. The way was opened to them in 1640s by peasant revolt and an attempted usurpation of the Chinese throne. An imperial general asked the Manchu to help him, and they came through the wall, but only to place their own dynasty, the Qing, on the throne in 1644, and incidentally wiped out the general's own clan. Like other barbarians and semi-barbarians, the Manchu had long been fascinated by the civilization they threatened and were already somewhat cynicized before their arrival. They were familiar with the Chinese administrative system, which they had imitated at their own capital of Macdon, and found it possible to cooperate with the Confucian gentry as they extended their grip on Chinese. The attachment of Manchu inspectors stimulated the bureaucracy, who needed to change little in their ways except to conform to Manchu practice of wearing pigtails. Thus was introduced what later struck Europeans as one of the oddest features of Chinese life. The cost of Manchu conquests was high. Some 25 million people perished, yet recovery was rapid. China's new power was already spectacularly apparent under the Emperor Kangxi, who reigned from 1662 to 1722. This roughly corresponded to the reign of Louis XIV of France, whose own exercises in magnificence and aggrandizement took different forms and showed curious parallels on the other side of the world. Kangxi was capable of a personal violence which the Sun king would never have permitted himself. He once attacked two of his sons with a dagger. But for all the difference in the historical backgrounds which formed them, there is a similarity in their style of rule. Jesuit observers speak of Kangxi's nobility of soul, and the description seems to have been prompted by more than the desire to flatter and justified by more than his patronage. He was hardworking, scrutinizing with a close eye the details of business and its manner, for he would painstakingly correct defective calligraphy in the memorials placed before him. And like Louis, he refreshed himself by indulging his passion for hunting. Characteristically, though, Kangxi was a foreigner and unusual among the Chinese emperors in admiring European skill. He patronized the Jesuits for their scientific knowledge. The merits of his reign were set firmly within accepted tradition. He identified himself with the enduring China. He rebuilt Peking, destroyed during the Manchu invasion, carefully restoring the work of Ming architects and sculptors. It was as if Versailles had been put up in the Gothic style or London rebuilt in perpendicular after the Great Fire. Kangxi's principles were Confucian, and he had classical works translated into Manchu. He sought to respect ancient tradition and assured his Chinese subjects their usual rights. They continued to rise to high office in the civil service, in spite of its opening to Manchu, and Kangxi's appointed Chinese generals and viceroys. In the style of his personal life, the emperor was, if not austere, at least moderate. He enjoyed the bracing life of the army and on campaigns lived simply. In Peking, the pleasures of the palace were deliberately reduced and the emperor relaxed from the burdens of the state within a harem of a mere 300 girls. Kangxi's extended imperial control to Formosa occupied Tibet, mastered the Mongols, and made them quiescent vassals. This was something of a turning point, as final as anything can be in history. From this time, the nomadic peoples of Central Asia at last began gradually to recede from the settler. Further north, in the Amur Valley, another new historical chapter opened when in 1685 a Chinese army attacked a Russian post at Albazin. There had been earlier clashes in Manchuria. Negotiations now led to the withdrawal of the Russians and the razing of their fort. The Treaty of Nyershins, which settled matters, conceded by implication that Russia was recognized as an independent entity and not as a vassal kingdom. Among its clauses, one prescribed that boundary posts should be set up with inscriptions not only in Russian, Manchu, Chinese, and Mongolian, but also in Latin. The suggestion had been made by a French Jesuit who was a member of the Chinese delegation, and like the establishment of a frontier line at all, was a symptom of changing Chinese relationships with the outside world. Relationships developing faster perhaps than any Chinese knew. The treaty was far from being the final settlement of the accounts between China and the only European power with which she shared a land frontier, but it quietened things for a time. Elsewhere, Manchu conquest continued to unroll. Later, in the 18th century, Tibet was again invaded and vassal status reimposed on Korea, Indochina, and Burma. These were major feats. At home, peace and prosperity marked the last year of Manchu success. It was a silver age of high classical civilization, which some scholars believe to have reached its peak under the later Ming. If it did, it could still produce much beauty and scholarship under Manchu. Great efforts of compilation and criticism, initiated and inspired by Kangxi himself, opened 100 years of transcription and publication, which was not only spawned such monsters as a 5,000-volume encyclopedia, but also collections of classical editions now given canonical form. In Kangxi's reign, too, the imperial kilns began a century of technical advance in enameling, which produced exquisite glazes. Yet, however admirable and however the emphasis is distributed between its various expressions in different arts, Manchu China's civilization was still, like that of its predecessors, the civilization of an elite. Although there was at the same time a popular culture of great vigor, the Chinese civilization which Europeans were struck by was as much the property of the Chinese ruling class as it always had been, a fusion of artistic, scholarly, and official activity. Its connection with the government still gave it a distinctive tone and color. It remained profoundly conservative, not only in social and political matters, but even in its aesthetic. The art it esteemed was based on a distrust of innovation and originality. It strove to imitate and emulate the best, but the best was always past. The traditional masterpieces pointed the way. Nor was art seen as the autonomous expression of aesthetic activity. Moral criteria were brought to the judgment of artistic work, and these criteria were, of course, the embodiments of Confucian values. Restraint, discipline, refinement, and respect for the great masters were the qualities admired by the scholar civil servant who was also artist and pattern, whatever appearances might suggest at first sight. Therefore, Chinese art was no more directed towards escape from conventional life and values than that of any other culture before the European 19th century. This was also paradoxically apparent in its traditional exaltation of the amateur and the disapprobation it showed towards professionals. The man most esteemed was the official or landowner who was able to execute with sureness and apparent lack of effort works of painting, calligraphy, or literature. Brilliant amateurs were greatly admired, and in their activities, Chinese art escapes from its anonymity. We often know such artists' names. Its beautiful ceramics and textiles, on the other hand, are the products of tradesmen whose names are lost, often working under the direction of civil servants. Artisans were not esteemed for originality. The craftsman was encouraged to develop his skill not to the point of innovation but towards technical perfection. Central direction of large bodies of craftsmen within the precincts of the imperial palace only imposed upon these arts all the more firmly the stamp of traditional style. Even a brilliant explosion of new technical masteries at the imperial kilns during the reign of Kangxi still expressed itself within the traditional canons of restraint and simplicity. The final paradox is the most obvious, and by the 18th century, it seems starkly apparent. For all her early technological advances, China never arrived at a mastery of nature which could enable her to resist Western intervention. Gunpowder is the most famous example. Chinese had it before anyone else, but could not make guns as good as those of Europe, nor even employ effectively those made for them by European craftsmen. Chinese sailors had long had the use of the mariner's compass and a cartographical heritage which produced the first grade map, but they were only briefly exploring navigators. They neither pushed across the Pacific like the more primitive Melanesians, nor did they map it, as did later the Europeans. For 600 years or so before Europe had them, the Chinese made mechanical clocks fitted with the escapement, which is the key to successful timekeeping by machines. Yet the Jesuits brought with them a horological technology far superior to the Chinese when they arrived in the 16th century. The list of unexploited intellectual triumphs could be much lengthened by important Chinese innovations in hydraulics, for example, but there is no need to do so. The main point is clear. Somehow, a lack of interest in utilization of invention was rooted in a Confucian social system, which, unlike that of Europe, did not regard as respectable any association between the gentleman and the technician. Pride in a great cultural tradition continued to make it very hard to recognize its inadequacies. This made learning from foreigners, all of whom were barbarians in Chinese eyes, very difficult. To make things worse, Chinese morality prescribed contempt for the soldier and for military skills. In a period when external threats could multiply, China was therefore dangerously cramped in her possibilities of response. Even under Kangxi, there were signs of new challenges ahead. In his old age, he had to restore Manchu power in Tibet when Mongol tribes had usurped it. The Russians were by 1700 installed in Kamchatka, were expanding their trade on the caravan routes, and were soon to press on into the Trans-Caspian region. Even peace and prosperity had a price, for they brought faster population growth. Here, unsolved because unrecognized and perhaps insoluble, was another problem to upset the stability of the order authorized by the mandate of heaven. By 1800, there were over 300, perhaps even 400 million Chinese, and already signs were appearing of what such an increase might portend. Chapter 8, Japan. There was a time when Englishmen liked to think of Japan as the Great Britain of the Pacific. The parallel was developed at many levels. Some were less plausible than others, but there was an indisputable hard nugget of reality in the facts of geography. Both are island kingdoms whose peoples' destinies have been shaped deeply by the sea. Both, too, live close to neighboring land masses whose influence on them could not but be profound. The Straits of Tsushima, which separate Korea from Japan, are about 5 times as wide as the Straits of Dover. It is true, and Japan was able to maintain an isolation from the Asian terra firma far from complete than any England could hope for from Europe. Nevertheless, the parallel can be pressed a good way, and its validity is shown by the excitement which the Japanese have always shown about the establishment of a strong power in Korea. It rivals that of the British over the danger that the Low Countries might fall into unfriendly hands. The Japanese proper probably arrived from Korea in about 300 BC, and when Japan emerges in her own historical records in the 8th century AD, there was Japanese held territory in Korean peninsula. In those days, Japan was a country divided up among a number of clans, presided over by an emperor with an ill-defined supremacy and an ancestry traced back to the sun goddess. The Japanese did not occupy the whole of the territory of modern Japan, but lived in the mainland on the southern and central islands. Here were the mildest climate and the best agricultural prospects. In prehistoric times, the introduction of rice growing and the fishing potential of Japanese waters had already made it possible for this mountainous country to feed a disproportionately large population. But pressure on land was to be a recurrent theme of Japanese history. In 645, a political crisis in the dominant clan brought about its downfall and a new one arose, the Fujiwara. It was to preside over a great age of Japanese civilization and to dominate the emperors. There was more than political significance in the change. It also marked a conscious effort to redirect Japanese life along the paths of renewal and reform. The direction could only be sought from the guidance offered by the highest example of civilization and power, of which the Japanese were aware and possibly the finest in the world at that time, that of Imperial China, which was also an example of expanding, menacing power. Its continuing and often changing relationship with China is another theme of Japanese history. Both peoples were of Mongoloid stock, though some Caucasoid, whose presence it is difficult to account for, also form a part of the Japanese ethnic heritage. These, the Aines, were at the beginning of historical era, mainly to be found in the northeast. In prehistoric times, Japan appears to have followed in the wake of the civilization of the mainland. Bronze artifacts, for example, appear in the islands only in the 1st century or so BC. Such innovations in the last millennium BC may owe something to immigrants displaced by the Chinese as they moved southwards on the mainland. But the first references to Japan in the Chinese records in the 3rd century AD still depict a country not much affected by mainland events, and Chinese influence was not very marked until the centuries following the Han collapse. Then, a vigorous Japanese intervention in Korea seems to have opened the way to closer contact. It was subsequently fostered by the movement of Buddhist students. Confucianism, Buddhism, and iron technology all came to Japan from China. There were attempts to bring about administrative changes on Chinese lines. Above all, Chinese writing had been brought to Japan, and its characters were used to provide a written form of the native language. Yet, cultural attraction and dependence had not meant political submission. The Japanese central administration was already well developed in scope and scale at the beginning of the period of centralization, and major efforts of reform were made in the 7th and 8th centuries. Yet, in the end, Japan evolved not in the direction of a centralized monarchy, but of what might be termed, in a Western analogy, feudal anarchy. For almost 900 years, it is hard to find a political thread of Japanese history. Its social continuity is much more obvious. From the beginnings of the historical era, even down to the present day, the keys to the continuity and toughness of Japanese society have been the family and the traditional religion. The clan was an enlarged family, and the nation the most enlarged family of all. In patriarchal system, the emperor presided over the national family, as did a clan leader over his clan, or even the small farmer over his family. The focus of family and clan life was participation in the traditional cult known as Shinto. Its ritual essence was the worship at shrines and in the family at the proper times of certain local and personal deities. This religious tradition upheld certain values and cosmological views, but it has no fixed doctrine, canonical scriptures, or even an identified founder. When Buddhism came to Japan in the 6th century, it was easily conjoined with this traditional way. The institutional coherence of old Japan was less marked than its social unity. The emperor was its focus. From the beginning of the 8th century, though, the emperor's power was more and more eclipsed, and so, in spite of the efforts of an occasional vigorous individual, it remained until the 19th century. This eclipse rose in part from the activities of the would-be reformers of the 7th century, for one of them was the founder of the great Fujiwara clan. In the next 100 years or so, his family tied itself closely to the imperial household by marriage. As children were frequently brought up in the household of their mother's family, the clan could exercise a crucial influence upon future emperors while they were children. In the 9th century, the chief of the Fujiwara was made regent for the emperor, who was an adult, and for most of what is called the Heian period, 794 to 1185. The name comes from that of the capital city, the modern Kyoto. That clan effectively controlled central government through marriage alliances and court office, its leaders acting in the emperor's name. The power of the Fujiwara did something to disguise the decline of the royal authority, but in fact the imperial clan was tending to become simply one among several which existed in the shade of the Fujiwara, each of them governing its own estates more or less independently. The displacement of the emperor became much more obvious after the passing of the power of the Fujiwara. The Kamukara period, 1185 to 1333, was so called because power passed to a clan whose states were in the area of that name, and the bypassing of the imperial court, which remained at Heian, became much more obvious. It was early in Kamakura period that there appeared the first of a series of military dictators who bore the title of shogun. They ruled in the emperor's name, but in fact with a large degree of independence. The emperor lived on the revenues of his own estates, and as long as he acquiesced in the shogun's intentions, he would have military power behind him. When he did not, he would be overruled.